The alarm on Captain James Mitchell's phone buzzed at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his scheduled 5:00 a.m. wake-up time. He silenced it immediately, a habit formed over 40 years of precision and discipline. Through the window of his Boulder home, the pre-dawn darkness was beginning to soften at the edges, that peculiar Colorado shade of dark blue that preceded sunrise. Mitchell lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, allowing his body to adjust to consciousness. At 62 years old, he still possessed the internal clock of a commercial pilot. His body knew it was time to wake, time to fly, time to do what he'd been doing for more than 4 decades with unwavering consistency. He rolled out of bed slowly, his knees creaking slightly, a reminder that his body was aging even if his spirit remained that of a younger man. The house was quiet and empty. His wife, Patricia, had passed away 3 years earlier after a brief illness that still felt surreal in its speed and finality. Their 2 adult children called regularly but lived in different states, each pursuing their own lives and families. Mitchell had thrown himself into flying with renewed intensity after her death, finding solace in the routine, the responsibility, and the undeniable reality of commanding an aircraft. Every flight was a meditation, a moment when the world's complications simplified into altitude, airspeed, and heading. Mitchell showered in water that was almost too hot, letting the steam open his sinuses and wake his mind fully. He'd always believed that a pilot's mental acuity was as critical as any mechanical instrument in the aircraft. He brushed his teeth with the same deliberate care he applied to everything in his life, examining his reflection in the mirror, gray hair receding slightly at the temples, lines around his eyes that deepened with squinting at distant horizons, the weathered face of a man who'd spent half his life looking at clouds and sky. He looked professional. He looked experienced. He looked exactly like a man who had never encountered a problem he couldn't handle. By 6:15 a.m., Mitchell was dressed in his uniform, navy blue pants with a crisp crease, white shirt with captain's insignia on the shoulders, tie knotted precisely, jacket hanging perfectly. The uniform was armor and identity combined. It commanded respect, inspired confidence, and represented decades of training, certification, and demonstrated competence. He'd worn variations of this uniform so many times that it felt more natural than civilian clothes. In his mind, he was already transitioning into captain mode, the professional persona that took precedence over everything else once he stepped into an airport. The drive to Denver International Airport took exactly 32 minutes along the I-70 corridor. Mitchell had made this drive thousands of times, and he knew it with the intimacy of long repetition. The early morning traffic was light, mostly delivery trucks and shift workers heading to various jobs. The sky was lightening now, moving from dark blue to pale purple to hints of orange on the distant horizon. Mitchell's mind was already running through the mental checklist that would culminate in his actual pre-flight inspection. Weather patterns, aircraft maintenance records, fuel calculations, passenger manifest, the specific runway conditions, altitude restrictions, traffic patterns. It was an intricate choreography of variables that he'd internalized so thoroughly it felt almost automatic. Denver International Airport sprawled across the landscape like a small city unto itself. Mitchell parked in the employee lot and made his way through the corridors he'd walked countless times before. The airport at this hour had a particular atmosphere, the calm before the storm of the day's passengers. Ground crews were already working, preparing aircraft for the day's operations. Baggage handlers moved with purposeful efficiency. The morning shift of airline employees moved through the terminals with the casual familiarity of people for whom this environment was simply workplace. Mitchell checked in at the operations office, collected his flight briefing materials, and reviewed the weather forecast for the Denver to Phoenix corridor. The meteorological report was pristine, clear skies, light winds, smooth conditions all the way to Arizona, perfect flying weather. The kind of day where pilots could almost fall asleep from sheer routine. Mitchell had learned never to be complacent during these calm, routine flights. He'd seen enough aviation incidents to know that disasters often struck on the most ordinary days, when alertness was at its lowest because conditions were so benign. At 7:45 a.m., Mitchell made his way to the aircraft, a regional jet that would carry 143 passengers plus 8 crew members. The aircraft was parked at the gate, already being serviced by ground crews. Mitchell conducted his external walk-around inspection with meticulous attention, running his hands along the fuselage, checking the control surfaces, examining the landing gear, confirming that everything was exactly as it should be. The plane was a reliable workhorse, well-maintained, with a solid safety record. He'd flown this exact aircraft model more than 200 times. By 8:15 a.m., passengers began arriving at the gate. They were a cross-section of America, businessmen in suits checking their phones obsessively, families with small children, elderly couples holding hands, college students with backpacks, a mix of humanity all traveling to Phoenix for reasons Mitchell would never know and didn't need to know. His job was simply to get them there safely, to transport them through the sky with the same reliability they expected from an elevator or an automobile. One passenger in particular stood out, though Mitchell wouldn't have been able to articulate why. An older gentleman, perhaps in his mid-60s, boarded with a small carry-on bag and a paperback novel. He wore casual clothes, no business suit, no sense of urgency. He moved with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to travel but unburdened by its pressures. He took a window seat in row 14, settled himself with measured deliberation, and opened his book. Something about his demeanor suggested a man at peace with himself and the world around him. Mitchell filed this observation away without conscious thought and continued his preparations. As the final passengers boarded and the crew completed their safety briefings, Mitchell performed his final checks in the cockpit. Co-pilot David Torres, a younger man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and steady hands, moved through his responsibilities with professional competence. The two men didn't need to say much. They developed the kind of wordless coordination that comes from thousands of hours working together. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. The weather was ideal. The aircraft was mechanically sound. The crew was alert and prepared. It was, in every measurable way, a routine Tuesday morning flight that would deliver all 143 passengers safely to Phoenix by early afternoon. Neither Mitchell nor anyone else aboard could have imagined that before that afternoon arrived, this routine flight would become one of the most discussed emergency landings in modern aviation history. The takeoff from Denver was textbook perfect. As Captain Mitchell advanced the throttles and felt the aircraft's engines surge with power, the nose lifted gently from the tarmac, and they became airborne. The wheels retracted with a satisfying mechanical hum, and the landscape of Colorado began falling away beneath them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the earth, illuminating the terrain in shades of brown and gold. From the cockpit windows, Mitchell could see the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance, their peaks still wearing caps of snow despite the advancing spring. Denver departure. Flight 447 is climbing through 3,000 feet, Mitchell transmitted to air traffic control, his voice the model of professional calm and clarity. The response came back immediately, authorizing them to continue their climb to their assigned cruising altitude of 28,000 feet. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, the way millions of flights had proceeded before, the way Mitchell expected this flight would proceed for the next 2 hours and 40 minutes until they touched down in Phoenix. Co-pilot David Torres was handling the radio communications while Mitchell focused on the actual flying. Torres was a careful, methodical aviator, exactly the kind of co-pilot Mitchell preferred to work with. The two men had flown together dozens of times, and they developed a rhythm that required minimal discussion. They understood each other's tendencies, anticipated each other's needs, and had cultivated the kind of professional rapport that only came from repeated exposure and mutual respect. Mitchell appreciated Tor's attention to detail and his calm demeanor under pressure. If something did go wrong today, Mitchell thought, he could trust Tor's to be reliable and steady. The climb progressed smoothly through 10,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 20,000 feet. The air became progressively thinner, and the engines worked harder to maintain their ascent. The outside air temperature dropped steadily. At this altitude, it was minus 47 degrees Celsius, though the pressurization system maintained a comfortable environment inside the cockpit. Through the windows, the sky transitioned from deep blue to an almost purple shade as they climbed higher than most of humanity ever traveled. Mitchell's eyes scanned the instrument panel with the periodic attention that had become automatic through decades of flying. There was nothing unusual. The engines were operating at normal parameters. The electrical systems were functioning correctly. The hydraulic pressure readings were nominal. The flight control surfaces were responding smoothly to his inputs on the control yoke. Everything was green across the board. That beautiful, safe, predictable configuration of lights and numbers that told a pilot their aircraft was operating exactly as designed. They leveled off at 28,000 feet, and Mitchell received clearance from Denver Air Traffic Control to maintain their assigned altitude and heading toward Phoenix. The autopilot engaged smoothly, allowing Mitchell to relax slightly in his seat. This was the cruise phase of the flight, the longest and generally the most uneventful portion of any flight. Most accidents happened during takeoff or landing, when the aircraft was at lower altitudes and required more intensive pilot input. Up here at cruise altitude, with clear weather and smooth air, Mitchell could afford to let some of the intensity ease from his shoulders. Tor's was updating the flight log, recording their current position, altitude, fuel consumption, and other parameters that required documentation. He glanced over at Mitchell and offered a slight smile, the kind of wordless acknowledgement that meant everything was proceeding normally, just another routine day at the office. Mitchell nodded in return. They'd been flying for about 40 minutes now, which meant they were roughly 1/3 of the way through the flight. Phoenix was still ahead of them, a destination that at this altitude and speed would take another 2 hours and 15 minutes to reach. Then, at 9:47 a.m., exactly 45 minutes and 32 seconds after takeoff, Captain James Mitchell heard a sound that instantly transformed his understanding of the day ahead. It was a grinding, metallic noise, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in an aircraft, the kind of sound that makes every instinct in a pilot's body scream that something is profoundly wrong. The noise came from somewhere in the bowels of the aircraft, a mechanical grinding that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but seemed to stretch into an eternity. Mitchell's entire body went rigid. His hand reflexively reached toward the control yoke, though the aircraft was still flying normally. His eyes snapped to the instrument panel with laser focus, scanning every gauge, every light, every digital readout. "Did you hear that?" Torres asked, his voice tightening slightly. The question was unnecessary. Of course Mitchell had heard it. The sound had been unmistakable, and both men understood instinctively that it represented a problem. Mitchell's eyes found the hydraulic pressure gauge, and his stomach dropped like he just crested the peak of a roller coaster. The needle was moving downward, not gradually, but rapidly, like a stock market crash displayed in real time. The hydraulic system was the lifeblood of the aircraft, the system that powered the control surfaces, operated the landing gear, and provided countless other critical functions. A failing hydraulic system was a serious emergency under any circumstances, but at 28,000 feet with 143 people aboard, it transformed into a nightmare scenario. "We've got a problem," Mitchell said quietly, his professional training overriding the adrenaline flooding his system. His voice remained level, controlled, the voice of a man in command who was not about to let panic take the controls. "Hydraulic pressure is failing. Rapidly." Torres leaned toward his instruments, and Mitchell watched as understanding dawned on his co-pilot's face. The younger man's jaw tightened, and he reached immediately for the emergency checklist that hung between them. "I'm pulling the hydraulic failure procedure," Torres said, already flipping through the laminated cards with practiced efficiency. The aircraft gave a subtle shudder, barely perceptible to anyone not specifically looking for it, but to Mitchell, it felt like the aircraft was trembling with distress. He immediately began running through his own mental checklist while Torres verbalized the official procedures. Check the hydraulic pump status. Verify the pressure readings. Check for any electrical anomalies that might have caused the failure. Every action was methodical, every movement precise. But underneath the professional protocol, Mitchell's mind was already racing ahead to worst-case scenarios. The hydraulic pressure continued to decline. Whatever had caused that grinding sound, a pump failure, a line rupture, a seal catastrophe, it was catastrophic and ongoing. The aircraft continued flying normally for the moment because the hydraulic pressure, while dropping, hadn't yet become low enough to prevent normal operation. But Mitchell understood physics and he understood aircraft systems. Without hydraulic pressure, he couldn't control the plane. Without control, they would fall. His hand moved to the radio. "Denver Center, Flight 447, he transmitted, his voice still perfectly level despite the ice in his veins. "We are declaring an emergency. We have a hydraulic system failure and are beginning descent to a suitable airport." The response came back immediately, and Mitchell heard the shift in the controller's tone, that subtle change that indicated they understood the severity of the situation. "Flight 447, Roger. Emergency declared. What is your nature of emergency?" "Hydraulic system failure," Mitchell confirmed. "Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." The controller's voice came back crisp and professional. "Flight 447, turn left to heading 90, begin descent at your discretion. Denver is currently your nearest divert airport, 170 miles to the north. We're scrambling emergency services now." Mitchell banked the aircraft to the left, disengaging the autopilot and taking full manual control. The moment his hands gripped the control yoke, the reality of the situation solidified. He was now responsible, directly and absolutely, for the survival of everyone aboard this aircraft. The responsibility that he'd carried abstractly for 4 decades had suddenly become concrete and overwhelming. The moment Captain Mitchell disconnected the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft, he felt something fundamentally change. The aircraft wasn't responding quite the way it should. The control inputs that normally produced smooth, predictable movements now felt sluggish, resistance building against his touch on the control yoke. His stomach clenched with the understanding that the hydraulic failure was already beginning to affect the aircraft's controllability. "Hydraulic pressure at 60% and dropping," Torres called out, reading the instruments with increasing urgency. The needle continued its downward journey across the gauge face. The numbers that should read in the normal operating range of 3,000 psi were now plummeting toward 2,000. Every second that passed, every tenth of a psi that disappeared, represented additional danger and reduced options. Mitchell initiated the descent carefully, mindful that every movement required more physical effort than it should. The control yoke felt heavier in his hands, as if the aircraft itself was resisting his commands. This was the nature of a hydraulic failure. Hydraulic fluid powered the actuators that moved the control surfaces. As the pressure dropped, those actuators became weaker, less responsive. It was like trying to turn a car's steering wheel with the power steering system failing. Still possible, but requiring significantly more force and generating significantly less precision. The descent began gradually, the aircraft losing altitude at a measured rate. At 28,000 feet, with a descent rate of 1,500 feet per minute, they had approximately 18 minutes to get to lower altitude before they had no altitude left. 18 minutes to solve a problem that was actively getting worse. Mitchell's mind was calculating constantly: fuel state, remaining hydraulic pressure, the rate at which that pressure was declining, the closest suitable airports, the weather conditions at those airports, the estimated time to reach them. Request immediate descent clearance to 20,000 feet, Mitchell transmitted to Denver Center, his voice still maintaining that professional calm despite the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The Colorado afternoon sun streamed through the cockpit windows at an angle that seemed almost cruel in its brightness, illuminating every detail of the instruments he was desperately trying to manage. Flight 447, you are cleared to descend to 20,000 feet, the controller responded immediately. Priority had shifted completely. This flight was no longer part of the routine traffic flow. This flight was an emergency, and every resource would be dedicated to getting them safely to the ground. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice that something was wrong. The aircraft's descent was gentle enough that it wasn't immediately alarming, but there was a quality to the way the plane was moving that felt different from normal operations. A woman in seat 12C gripped her armrest. A businessman who'd been working on his laptop closed it and put it away, his casual demeanor shifting to something more alert. A mother traveling with two small children pulled them closer, though she didn't fully understand what she was sensing. Then, at 24,000 feet, there was another sound, a more serious grinding that lasted longer than the first one. It was followed immediately by a violent shudder that ran through the entire aircraft, strong enough that overhead bins rattled and a carry-on bag fell into the aisle. Oxygen masks deployed automatically from the ceiling compartments with a loud hissing sound. "Oh my God," someone screamed in the cabin. "Oh my God, what's happening?" Flight attendant Maria Santos, a veteran of 19 years with the airline, immediately sprang into action. She'd done this thousands of times in training, but never in a real emergency. Her training kicked in, reassure passengers, move through the cabin with purpose and confidence, reinforce the message that the crew had the situation under control even if her heart was hammering in her chest. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," Maria called out, her voice steady despite the fear flooding through her veins. "We are experiencing a mechanical issue, and the captain is handling it. Please secure your oxygen masks if they are not already secure and keep them on. Remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." In the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating with alarming speed. The hydraulic pressure had dropped to 1,500 psi, and the rate of decline had accelerated. TORS was running through the hydraulic failure procedures, but each step confirmed the same reality. There was no recovery. This was a catastrophic failure, not something that could be reset or bypassed through standard procedures. "Hydraulic pressure at 1,200 and dropping rapidly," TORS reported, his voice tightening further. Mitchell could see the fear creeping into his co-pilot's composure, but TORS was fighting to maintain his professionalism. The younger pilot understood what this meant as clearly as Mitchell did. Without hydraulic pressure, they couldn't lower the landing gear. They couldn't maneuver the flight control surfaces with precision. They were flying an aircraft that was rapidly becoming unflyable. Mitchell reduced the descent rate slightly, trying to conserve altitude and buy time. Every foot of altitude was a precious commodity now, a buffer between them and the earth below. The Rocky Mountains were still beneath them, jagged terrain that offered no mercy to an aircraft without full control capability. "Denver, Flight 447, Mitchell transmitted again. "Hydraulic system failure is continuing to deteriorate. Request we be cleared direct to Denver International, estimating critical hydraulic failure within 10 minutes. The controller's response came back immediately, stripped of any casual phrasing. "Flight 447 understood. You are cleared direct to Denver. Distance 150 miles. Emergency services are being activated. Dispatch has requested your current fuel state." TORS quickly calculated the fuel. "We have approximately 45 minutes of fuel at current consumption rates," he reported. That should be sufficient to reach Denver if we maintain current descent. The word "if" hung heavily in the cockpit. If the hydraulic system didn't fail completely, if the engines continued operating normally, if they could maintain enough control to keep the aircraft in stable flight, if the winds didn't shift, if a dozen other variables aligned in their favor. At 20,000 feet, the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Mitchell could feel the responsiveness degrading with every passing second. The control yoke required increasingly forceful inputs to achieve the desired effects. Sweat was running down his temples now, and his shoulders ached from the physical effort of controlling an aircraft that was rapidly becoming recalcitrant. His mind kept jumping ahead to the worst possibility. What if the hydraulic system failed completely? What if the control surfaces became completely frozen? What if they simply fell from the sky like a stone? In the cabin, passengers were gripping armrests in each other. Some were crying openly. Others were praying, whispered words in various languages, pleas directed toward whatever spiritual power they believed might intercede on their behalf. A mother held her daughter so tightly the child couldn't breathe properly. An elderly couple held hands, their knuckles white with tension, their eyes closed. The aircraft descended through 18,000 feet, then 16,000 feet. Every 1,000 feet of altitude lost was progress toward a landing, but it also represented diminishing options. If the hydraulic system failed now, they might glide to the ground. But at 10,000 feet or below, they were too low to recover, too low to implement any emergency procedures that required altitude. Hydraulic pressure at 800 psi, Torres called out, his voice now shaking slightly despite his best efforts at control. We're approaching critical failure threshold. Mitchell's hands gripped the control yoke tighter. The mountains below seemed to be reaching up toward them like claws. In his 40 years of flying, he'd never been this afraid, this certain that conventional solutions wouldn't work, this acutely aware that the survival of 143 people was balanced on the edge of a knife blade, dependent entirely on variables he could no longer control. At 14,000 feet, with hydraulic pressure continuing its catastrophic decline, Captain James Mitchell faced a decision that violated every protocol he'd ever learned, every regulation that governed commercial aviation, and every instinct he'd developed over 4 decades of professional flying. The aircraft was becoming increasingly uncontrollable. Standard emergency procedures weren't working. The backup systems were failing in sequence, each loss of pressure capability eliminating options one by one. He was running out of time, and he was running out of solutions. Torres was pale, his young face etched with the realization that they were in territory beyond training, beyond the simulated emergencies they'd practiced. "Captain, we're down to 600 psi," he said, his voice wavering. "The procedures say we should attempt to reach an airport, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both understood what remained unsaid. But what if they couldn't maintain control long enough? But what if the system failed completely? But what if conventional solutions simply weren't enough? Mitchell's mind was racing through possibilities at superhuman speed. He'd been trained to handle emergencies, to follow procedures, to remain calm and analytical. But he'd never been trained for this. A catastrophic failure that was eliminating his options faster than he could develop contingencies. His hands were aching from the physical effort of maintaining control over an aircraft that was fighting him, fighting gravity, fighting the laws of physics. The descent continued toward 12,000 feet. The Rocky Mountains were still below them, still waiting. Denver International was still over 100 miles away. At the aircraft's current descent rate, they had perhaps 20 minutes before they either reached Denver or ran out of options, whichever came first. 20 minutes to solve a problem that was getting worse every single second. Mitchell made a decision in that moment that surprised even himself, a decision born of desperation rather than protocol, but a decision he understood might be their only chance. He turned to Torres and said something that would later seem almost absurd. "David, I'm going back to the cabin. Maintain this heading and this descent rate. If anything changes significantly, call me immediately on the intercom." Torres looked at him with shock and confusion. "Captain, where are you going? We need you in here." "I know," Mitchell said, his jaw tight. "But if we're going to survive this, I might need help, and that help could only come from the people back there." Mitchell unbuckled his seat harness with movements that felt mechanical and surreal. He was abandoning the cockpit during an emergency, a violation so fundamental that it went against everything he'd been taught. But the alternative was to stay at the controls, while the situation continued deteriorating around him with no possible solution in sight. Sometimes the most radical choice was the only choice that made sense. He moved toward the cockpit door with a sense of unreality, as if he were watching himself from outside his body. Through the small window, he could see the cabin beyond, faces turned upward in fear, hands gripping armrests, the visible manifestation of human terror at 12,000 feet with a crippled aircraft. Opening the cockpit door broke the barrier between the protected flight deck and the exposed cabin. The anxiety that had been muted was suddenly amplified, a wave of fear that washed over Mitchell as he stepped through. Passengers immediately looked toward him, their eyes desperate, searching for reassurance in the face of their captain. Flight attendant Maria Santos approached him immediately. "Captain, the passengers are asking," she began, but Mitchell cut her off gently. "Maria, I need everyone's attention," Mitchell called out, his voice loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of stressed aircraft systems and frighten people. The cabin fell quiet almost immediately. All eyes turned toward him. "I need to ask you something important. It's a direct question, and I need honest answers." Mitchell's voice was steady, but there was something in his expression, a desperation barely held in check, that made clear this wasn't a routine announcement. The businesswoman in seat 3A stopped texting. The college students in the back row lowered their phones. The elderly couple holding hands leaned forward slightly. The mother with children pulled them closer. "Does anyone aboard this aircraft have experience with aircraft systems, aviation experience, aerospace engineering, hydraulics, anything related to how this aircraft operates?" The question hung in the cabin like a physical thing. Most passengers looked confused or shook their heads slowly. A woman in seat 8B raised her hand tentatively. "I'm a pilot," she said. "I fly Cessnas, small aircraft. I'm not sure if that." "What's your name?" Mitchell asked immediately. Susan Hoffman." "Susan, thank you for volunteering," Mitchell said, and he meant it, though what he desperately needed was someone with much more specialized knowledge. "Stay available in case we need you." Mitchell continued scanning the cabin, his eyes moving from face to face, his hopes slowly starting to fade. Most people were looking at him with confusion or dread. Some were crying silently. Children stared with the innocent incomprehension of those too young to understand mortality. Mitchell felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. Then slowly, deliberately, a hand rose from row 14, the seat window on the right side where the quiet gentleman with the paperback had been sitting. The same man Mitchell had noticed during boarding because of his composed demeanor. The man who seemed untouched by the fear radiating from everyone around him. "I might be able to help," the man said calmly, unclasping his seatbelt with measured movements. His voice carried a quality of absolute certainty, a confidence that seemed almost surreal given the circumstances. He stood up in the aisle, and Mitchell could see that his hands were steady, his breathing regular, his overall demeanor that of someone facing a problem rather than a catastrophe. "What's your name, sir?" Mitchell asked, moving toward him. "Robert Chen," the man replied, beginning to move toward the cockpit with a purposeful stride. "And I spent 35 years as an aerospace engineer designing hydraulic systems for commercial aircraft." The words seemed to stop time for a moment. Mitchell felt something shift in his chest, a sensation between relief and disbelief. The probability of this was almost impossible to calculate. What were the odds that of all the passengers on this flight, randomly distributed across the cabin, the one person with exactly the expertise needed was sitting in row 14? "Dr. Chen," Mitchell said, his voice steadier now, "I need you in the cockpit immediately." As Chen moved past the other passengers, Mitchell caught fragments of their reactions. Some passengers looked shocked. Others seemed to gain a tentative hold on hope. The mother with children whispered something to them that might have been a prayer or reassurance. Susan Hoffman, the small aircraft pilot, looked relieved that someone with deeper expertise had materialized. Mitchell led Chen back toward the cockpit, aware that Torres would be confused by his absence. The aircraft was still descending through 11,000 feet. The hydraulic pressure was still dropping, but something had changed. The impossible had become possible. The nightmare had developed a potential exit. As they reached the cockpit door, Mitchell paused for just a moment and looked at this stranger, this man who might be the difference between disaster and survival. "Thank you for volunteering," Mitchell said. "I hope you're as good as you say you are, because right now, that's the only thing standing between us and catastrophe." Chen met his eyes calmly. "I am," he said simply. "Let me see what we're dealing with." Cockpit door closed behind Dr. Robert Chen with a soft click, sealing him into the pressurized chamber where Captain Mitchell and co-pilot Torres were locked in their struggle to keep an increasingly uncontrollable aircraft in the sky. Torres looked up from the instruments with shock written across his face, clearly expecting Mitchell and finding instead a stranger in civilian clothes. "David, this is Dr. Robert Chen," Mitchell said quickly, his words coming fast but controlled. "Dr. Chen, meet David Torres, my co-pilot. We're losing hydraulic pressure at a critical rate, and I need you to tell me if there's anything we can do that we haven't already tried." Chen stepped forward with the casual confidence of a man entering his natural environment. He didn't look panicked or overwhelmed. Instead, he moved directly to the instrument panel and began examining the readings with the focused intensity of someone reading a familiar language. His eyes tracked across the gauges, the hydraulic pressure indicator, the electrical system readouts, the engine parameters, the altitude and descent rate information. For a moment, he said nothing, just absorbing information, processing data, letting his decades of experience wash over the situation. "How long has the pressure been dropping?" Chen asked, his voice calm and methodical. "Initial failure was at approximately 9:47 this morning," Mitchell replied. "We heard a grinding sound and the pressure started failing immediately. That was about 5 minutes ago. It's been a constant decline ever since." Chen nodded slowly, his weathered face showing deep concentration. He reached out and traced his finger along the hydraulic pressure gauge, watching the needle's continued downward movement. "What procedures have you already executed?" he asked. Torres answered quickly, his voice gaining confidence from Chen's calm presence. "We've checked for electrical anomalies that might have caused a pump failure. We've verified that the backup systems are also failing, which suggests a line rupture rather than isolated pump failure. We've attempted to isolate the failed circuit, but the pressure continues dropping." "Cascade failure," Chen murmured almost to himself. "The initial rupture has caused secondary damage as the fluid pressure dropped. Classic hydraulic failure mode." He turned to look directly at Mitchell. "Captain, you're currently maintaining control through the primary hydraulic system, correct? Flying the aircraft with powered control surfaces." "Affirmative," Mitchell confirmed. "But the control inputs are becoming increasingly sluggish. The aircraft is getting harder to fly, not easier." Chen's eyes moved back to the instrument panel, and something shifted in his expression. A subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth, a deepening of the lines on his forehead. He was seeing something, understanding something, reaching into reserves of knowledge that spanned 3.5 decades. "What year was this aircraft manufactured?" Chen asked suddenly. 2008, Torres answered. "Why does that matter?" "It might," Chen said. He looked at Mitchell with an intensity that made the captain lean forward. "Captain, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to answer with complete honesty. How much do you know about the manual hydraulic backup systems on this aircraft?" Mitchell's jaw tightened slightly. "The basics, emergency procedures, why?" "Because," Chen said slowly, "the standard checklist for hydraulic failure focuses on the powered systems, the automatic backups, the conventional routes to maintaining control. But this aircraft, this specific model from this era, has a manual backup system that was designed for exactly this type of cascade failure. Not many pilots use it because they rarely need it, and it's not the primary focus of training. But it exists." "Are you saying there's a way to control the aircraft manually?" Torres asked, his voice rising slightly with hope. "Not easily," Chen cautioned, "and not through the normal control surfaces. But the designers of this aircraft understood that there might be situations where all the powered hydraulic systems failed. So they built in a mechanical backup, a direct linkage system to certain flight control surfaces that can be operated purely mechanically. No hydraulic pressure required." Mitchell felt something that might have been hope, though he forced himself to temper it. "What control surfaces are we talking about?" Chen turned back to the instrument panel, his fingers now moving with purposeful precision. "The rudder can be operated through a cable-based system. The trim tabs on the wings have a mechanical input. These aren't the primary flight controls. You won't have full control authority, but they'll give you enough control to maintain stable flight and eventually land the aircraft." "Where is this mechanical system accessed?" Mitchell asked, already understanding that he needed to know exactly what Chen was proposing. "There's a manual control panel in the aft section of the cockpit," Chen explained. "Behind the co-pilot station. It's never used in normal operations, so most pilots forget it exists, but it's there and it's functional. I designed the specifications for it back in 1995, before this model even went into production." The statement hung in the air for a moment, the revelation that this man wasn't just someone with aerospace knowledge, but someone who had literally designed the very backup systems they were now discussing. Mitchell felt the surreal quality of the situation intensify. The probability wasn't just unlikely, it was statistically impossible. And yet here it was, unfolding before him. "Show me," Mitchell said simply. Chen moved toward the rear of the cockpit with Torres right behind him. Mitchell kept one hand on the control yoke, maintaining their descent trajectory even as he craned his neck to see what was happening. Chen was pointing to a panel that Mitchell had walked past hundreds of times without truly seeing it, a gray metal plate mounted near the aft bulkhead, marked with faded stickers that indicated it was emergency equipment. "This panel is connected to the cable systems that run throughout the aircraft," Chen explained, his fingers tracing the outline. "The lever here controls the rudder angle. The knobs operate the trim systems. It's crude compared to the powered systems, and you'll have less precise control, but it will allow you to steer the aircraft and adjust pitch. Combined with engine power manipulation, you might be able to maintain stable flight long enough to reach an airport." Torres was already opening the access panel, revealing a mechanical system that looked almost primitive compared to the modern electronics surrounding it. Simple levers, basic cables, mechanical linkages, technology that would have been cutting edge in the 1970s but seemed almost ancient by modern standards. "How much longer do we have before complete hydraulic failure?" Chen asked, his eyes moving back to the pressure gauge. "At this rate of decline, perhaps 8 to 10 minutes, Mitchell replied, "maybe less." "Then we need to transition control immediately," Chen said. "Not wait until the system completely fails. The transition will be easier if we do it while you still have some powered control available to help you adjust to the mechanical system's feel." Mitchell nodded, understanding the logic. "Co-pilot Torres, I want you to start operating the manual systems while I still have powered control for reference. Dr. Chen, I need you to talk us through this transition step by step. Tell me exactly what inputs correspond to what control movements. What happened next was a remarkable demonstration of knowledge meeting crisis. Dr. Chen, drawing from 3.5 decades of aerospace engineering experience, began explaining the mechanical control systems with the precision of a master teacher. He walked tours through each lever, each knob, each cable connection, explaining how the mechanical inputs would translate to control surface movements. Mitchell maintained the aircraft's descent while monitoring both the powered systems, which were failing, and the mechanical systems, which Torres was beginning to engage. The aircraft responded sluggishly to the mechanical inputs at first, the cables and linkages moving through slack before engaging fully. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the feel of the aircraft in Mitchell's hands began to change. "It's working," Torres breathed, his voice filled with cautious wonder. "The mechanical systems are actually responding." "Slowly," Chen cautioned, "and with less authority than the powered systems, but they'll keep the aircraft controllable long enough to reach the airport. Captain, you need to adjust your flying technique. Smaller control inputs, more anticipation of the aircraft's response. The mechanical systems have more lag than the hydraulic systems." Mitchell was already adapting, his hands working the control yoke with the sensitivity of a virtuoso musician. His decades of flying experience were translating into muscle memory that could adapt to a completely different control system. The aircraft felt foreign in his hands, like flying an aircraft from a completely different era, but it was responding. At 10,000 feet, the hydraulic pressure finally dropped below 100 psi, essentially a complete failure. The powered control systems went dead, becoming inert mechanical objects rather than responsive control inputs. But Mitchell didn't panic, didn't feel despair. Because for the first time since that grinding sound at 28,000 feet, he had options again. They had a way forward. They had a chance. Dr. Robert Chen positioned himself at the aft mechanical control panel, his hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had spent decades understanding the intimate mechanics of aircraft control systems. Captain Mitchell maintained his grip on the control yoke, feeling the aircraft respond through mechanical linkages that hadn't been designed with the expectation that they'd ever be the primary means of flight control. The sensation was profoundly different from powered flight. It was like the difference between power steering and manual steering on a vintage automobile, except this automobile was falling from the sky. "Okay, Captain," Chen said, his voice steady and instructional. "I'm going to walk you through how the mechanical systems respond. They're going to feel sluggish compared to what you're used to. There's inherent lag in the system because the cables have to physically move before the control surfaces respond. You need to anticipate this. Make your inputs smaller and smoother than you normally would. Think of it as steering a large ship rather than a fighter jet." "Understood," Mitchell replied, his voice clipped and professional. He was already adapting his flying technique, making minute adjustments to the control yoke based on feedback from the aircraft's response. The aircraft had descended to 9,500 feet, and they were still losing altitude at approximately 2,000 feet per minute. That gave them roughly 4.5 minutes before they reached ground level, which meant roughly 4.5 minutes to stabilize the descent and establish a glide path toward Denver International Airport. Torres was monitoring the engine parameters obsessively, watching for any sign that they might lose power in addition to hydraulic control. "Engines are still nominal," he called out, his voice tight with concentration. "Both running at optimal parameters. We still have full thrust available." "That's critical," Chen said, moving toward the cockpit windows to look out at the landscape ahead. "Without engine power, we couldn't maintain altitude long enough to reach the airport. The mechanical systems can keep the aircraft stable, but they can't generate lift. Engine thrust is what keeps us airborne." Mitchell made another adjustment to the control yoke, and the aircraft responded with a perceptible delay. It was like fighting through water, each movement requiring conscious thought and deliberate execution. The modern powered control systems had spoiled pilots into expecting instantaneous response. This mechanical system operated on an entirely different timeline, but it was working. The aircraft was responding, even if the response was slower and less precise than ideal. "Dr. Chen," Mitchell said, keeping his eyes fixed on the instruments ahead, "I need you to tell me exactly what each mechanical input does. Specifically, I need to understand the trim systems and how they'll affect our descent rate." Chen moved to stand between the pilot and co-pilot seats, his eyes focused on the mechanical control panel while maintaining awareness of the instrument readouts. "The trim tabs are your primary tool for adjusting the aircraft's pitch," he explained, his engineer's mind breaking down complex systems into understandable components. "The main elevator controls, the primary pitch control, will be difficult to operate mechanically because they require significant force. But the trim tabs require minimal force and provide gradual pitch adjustment. You'll want to use these primarily." "How much adjustment authority do we have?" Torres asked, clearly thinking ahead to the landing approach. "Enough," Chen said carefully. "Not as much as we'd like, but enough. The trim systems can give you roughly plus or minus 15 degrees of pitch authority. That's sufficient to transition from descent to level flight and eventually to a shallow descent for landing. It will just require patience and anticipation." Mitchell was already making small inputs to the trim system, watching as the aircraft's descent rate slowly began to decrease. The nose came up microscopically, almost imperceptibly, but the descent rate on the altimeter began to flatten. From 2,000 feet per minute descent, it dropped to 1,800, then 1,600, then 1,400. "It's working," Torres breathed, his eyes locked on the descent rate indicator. "We're slowing the descent." "Don't get complacent," Chen cautioned. "We're at 8,000 feet now. At current descent rate, we have about 5.5 minutes to ground level. We need to continue reducing this descent rate until we're in a stable glide. And we still need to extend the landing gear and configure for landing, which will increase drag and slow us further." The mention of landing gear made Mitchell's stomach tighten. The landing gear was mechanically lowered through a hydraulic actuator. Without hydraulic pressure, the gear wouldn't extend automatically. "Dr. Chen, what about the landing gear? How do we get the wheels down?" "Manual extension," Chen replied immediately, as if he'd been expecting the question. "There's a manual gear extension handle in the cockpit, directly beneath the control panel on the left side. Once you've stabilized the descent and established an approach, you'll need to operate that handle manually. It requires significant physical force, probably 70 to 80 pounds of pressure, but it will extend the landing gear mechanically." "And the flaps?" Torres asked. "We'll need flaps for landing." Chen's expression tightened slightly. "The flaps are where we have a limitation. The mechanical system provides limited flap extension authority. You'll have access to partial flap deployment, approximately 20 degrees, but not full extension. That means your landing approach will need to be longer and shallower than normal. You'll need more runway distance." Mitchell was already calculating. Denver International had long runways, multiple options, good infrastructure. They would work with what they had. The aircraft descended through 7,500 feet, and the descent rate had dropped to 1,200 feet per minute. Progress. Slow, methodical progress, but progress nonetheless. "How's the flight handling?" Chen asked, watching Mitchell's hands on the control yoke. "Getting better," Mitchell replied. "I'm adapting to the lag. The mechanical system is actually quite responsive once you understand its characteristics. It's just different. Everything is different." "That's exactly right," Chen said, and there was something almost professorial in his tone now, as if he were speaking to a student who was mastering a difficult concept. The powered systems were designed for precision and speed of response. The mechanical systems were designed for reliability and simplicity. In normal operations, the powered systems are superior. But in a complete failure scenario, The mechanical systems become elegant precisely because they don't depend on complex electronics or pressurized hydraulic fluid. They're pure physics, cables, levers, hinges, and mechanical advantage. The aircraft continued descending, and Mitchell continued the painstaking process of reducing the descent rate. At 6,500 feet, they had stabilized at approximately 800 feet per minute descent. The landscape below was becoming progressively more detailed. Individual buildings, vehicles on highways, the geometric patterns of suburban development surrounding Denver. Air traffic control, Flight 447, Mitchell transmitted, his voice steady despite the intensity of his focus. We are currently maintaining controlled flight at 6,500 feet, descending at 800 feet per minute. Request landing clearance for runway 35 left. We will require the longest available runway due to limited control authority. The response came back immediately. Flight 447 confirmed. You are cleared to land runway 35 left. Emergency equipment is standing by. Current wind is from 340 degrees at 8 knots. You have approximately 30 miles to touchdown. Rate of descent is acceptable for controlled landing. Torres looked at Chen with something approaching wonder. We're going to make it, aren't we? We're actually going to make it. Chen didn't smile, but his expression softened slightly. We have a very good chance, he said carefully. But let's not celebrate until the wheels are down and we're safely on the ground. There are still significant challenges ahead. Mitchell was already thinking about those challenges. They needed to extend the landing gear without hydraulic power. They needed to establish a precise approach with severely limited control authority. They needed to execute a landing on an aircraft that was responding mechanically rather than electronically. They needed to do all of this while managing 3 engines that were still running normally, because any failure there would turn controlled descent into catastrophe. But for the first time since that grinding sound at 28,000 feet, Mitchell believed they might actually survive this. The final approach to Denver International Airport transformed from concept into terrifying reality as Captain Mitchell guided the crippled aircraft toward the runway. At 5,000 feet, with the airport clearly visible ahead and emergency vehicles already stationed along the landing zone, the true gravity of what they were about to attempt became undeniable. This wasn't a theoretical exercise or a simulated emergency. This was the moment where months of training, decades of experience, and the precise knowledge of one remarkable engineer would be tested against the unforgiving laws of physics. Flight 447, you are 15 miles from touchdown, the control tower transmitted. Descend and maintain 3,000 feet, clear to begin approach procedures. Mitchell acknowledged the clearance and began the gradual process of transitioning from cruise descent to landing approach. The mechanical control systems continued responding, sluggish but functional, as he made minute adjustments to the trim tabs. The aircraft's nose came up slightly, and the descent rate decreased further. They were now descending at approximately 600 feet per minute, still faster than ideal but manageable. We need to extend the landing gear now, Dr. Chen said, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Captain, the manual gear extension handle is directly beneath the control panel on your left. It's a red handle with a mechanical lock. You need to pull it straight toward you with steady, consistent force. The mechanism will require significant physical effort. Mitchell glanced down at the location Chen had indicated. He could see the red handle, almost innocuous in appearance, yet absolutely critical to their survival. Without the landing gear extended, they would attempt to land on a fuselage not designed to contact the runway. The aircraft would slide, break apart, and quite possibly become an inferno. I'll handle the landing gear, Torres volunteered immediately. Captain, you maintain control of the aircraft. I'll execute the manual extension. Mitchell nodded, grateful for the division of labor. At this moment, every task needed to be assigned clearly, executed perfectly. Torres unbuckled his seat harness and reached down toward the manual gear extension handle. Mitchell could feel the aircraft beginning to respond sluggishly to his inputs, the mechanical control systems demanding his full attention and physical effort. Torres grasped the red handle firmly and began pulling with steady, deliberate force. "It's not moving," he said, his voice straining slightly. The handle was designed to resist accidental operation, to require deliberate effort to activate. Torres increased the pressure, his entire body engaged in the effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he strained against the mechanical resistance. "Keep steady pressure," Chen instructed. "Don't jerk. The mechanism needs consistent force to overcome the locking detent." The aircraft descended through 4,000 feet, then 3,500 feet. Below them, Denver sprawled in its geometric grid pattern, the runway now clearly visible in the distance, emergency vehicles creating a line of red lights along the approach zone. Mitchell's hands ached from the effort of controlling the aircraft mechanically, but he couldn't afford to ease his grip. Even momentary inattention would result in unwanted pitch or yaw adjustments. Then suddenly Torres gasped. "It's moving, the handle is moving." The mechanical landing gear extension system engaged with a series of metallic clunks that reverberated through the aircraft. Mitchell felt the subtle shift in aerodynamics as the landing gear began descending into the slipstream. The drag increased immediately. The descent rate jumped from 600 to 700 feet per minute as the extended gear caught the wind. "Gear is down and locked," Torres announced, his voice rising with tentative hope. "All three wheels are extended and secured." The aircraft continued descending through 3,000 feet, then 2,500 feet. The runway was now filling the windscreen ahead, the perspective changing from distant stripe to imminent landing zone. Mitchell could see the fire trucks and ambulances lining the sides of the runway, could see the foam trucks standing ready with their contents poised to suppress potential flames. "Flight 447, you are cleared to land," the control tower transmitted. "Winds are 340 at 8 knots. You have the entire length of runway 35 left available. Emergency services are standing by." "Copy that," Mitchell replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Flight 447 is on final approach." At 1,500 feet, Mitchell began making the critical adjustments to establish the proper descent angle. The mechanical trim systems responded with their characteristic lag, and he had to anticipate the aircraft's movements several seconds ahead, thinking in advance of what correction would be needed. It was flying in a way that demanded total engagement of his conscious mind. No room for autopilot, literally or figuratively. Dr. Chen stood in the cockpit, his aged eyes tracking the altitude readout and the runway ahead. "Looking good, Captain," he said. "Your descent angle is approximately 3 degrees. That's right where we need it. Maintain this profile." The runway appeared to be rising toward them at an accelerating rate. Mitchell could see the threshold markings now, the precise white lines that marked the beginning of the landing surface. Beyond that, 12,000 feet of runway stretched ahead, more than enough distance for the landing they were about to execute. At 500 feet, Mitchell reduced power slightly to increase the descent rate, wanting to arrive at the runway threshold with the aircraft in the optimal configuration. The mechanical systems continued their sluggish but reliable response. The aircraft descended through 400 feet, then 300 feet. The runway filled the entire forward field of vision now, details becoming acutely sharp, the texture of the asphalt, the painted markings, the perfectly maintained surface. 200 feet, Torres called out, reading the altitude. 150 feet, 100 feet. Mitchell's hands were locked on the control yoke, every muscle in his body engaged in the act of flying. The mechanical systems required constant input, constant adjustment. There was no autopilot, no computer to make microcorrections. It was pure piloting, pure human skill and experience translated into control inputs. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. The runway was below them now, rushing toward them at a closing speed that seemed simultaneously agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast. Mitchell made final adjustments, reducing power further, beginning to flare the nose up slightly to establish the landing attitude. 20 feet, 10 feet. The first indication of contact came as a gentle compression, the nose gear touching down with a subtle jolt. For an instant, Mitchell held his breath, waiting to see if the landing gear would hold, if the aircraft would respond as designed. It did. The main landing gear contacted the runway with a heavier impact, the aircraft settling onto all three wheels with a grinding sensation that Mitchell could feel through the control yoke. The wheels screamed against the asphalt as the aircraft's momentum translated into friction, the landing gear absorbing the impact, the airframe shuddering with the violent transition from flight to ground. Mitchell immediately deployed the air brakes, increasing drag to slow their forward progress. The aircraft began decelerating, the runway streaking past beneath them at decreasing speed. 100 knots, 80 knots, 60 knots. The aircraft was slowing but still moving at dangerous speed. Reverse thrust, Chen suggested calmly. Engines can provide reverse thrust for additional braking. Mitchell reached for the thrust reversers, engaging them with a decisive movement. The engine's roar changed pitch, the aircraft lurching forward slightly as the engines began pushing air backward instead of forward, adding tremendous braking force. The deceleration became more aggressive, pressing all three men forward in their seats. 40 knots, 30 knots, 20 knots. The aircraft slowed to a creeping pace, the runway ahead becoming less urgent, the runway behind them becoming irrelevant. Mitchell continued forward, bringing the throttles back to idle, allowing the aircraft to coast to a complete stop. Then finally silence. The aircraft was motionless on the runway of Denver International Airport. The engines wound down their high-pitched whine to a gentle idle. Mitchell realized he'd been holding his breath. He released it slowly, then looked over at Torres, whose eyes were bright with tears. Chen stood quietly, his weathered face showing no triumph, only quiet satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell transmitted to the cabin, his voice hoarse with emotion, "welcome to Denver. We're safely on the ground." Cabin door swung open to a world transformed by survival. Emergency personnel poured onto the aircraft with the practiced efficiency of people trained for precisely this scenario, though the actual execution of their training was rare enough that the reality still felt surreal. Captain James Mitchell remained in the cockpit for several minutes after the engines went silent, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. Torres sat motionless beside him, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't quite believe they were still alive, still intact, still breathing. Dr. Robert Chen had already unbuckled his harness and moved toward the cockpit door, his expression calm and measured, the expression of a man who had completed a task rather than survived a miracle. Mitchell reached out and grasped his arm before he could leave. "Dr. Chen," Mitchell said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't have words adequate to express what you've done today. You saved 143 lives, mine included." Chen turned to look at him, and for the first time something that might have been emotion flickered across his weathered face. "Captain, you flew this aircraft to safety. I simply provided technical guidance. The credit belongs to you and your co-pilot. Your training, your experience, your refusal to panic, that's what made the difference." "No," Mitchell said firmly. "Without you, we don't survive this. Without you, everyone on this aircraft dies. There's no scenario where we make it without your expertise." The two men stood for a moment in the sudden silence of the powered-down cockpit, understanding passing between them that transcended words. Then Chen nodded once and made his way toward the cabin, where the real aftermath was unfolding. The cabin had transformed into a scene of overwhelming emotion. Passengers were embracing flight attendants, crying, laughing. some praying with hands clasped together. A mother held her young daughter so tightly the child could barely breathe, whispering words of gratitude into the girl's hair. The elderly couple that had sat together throughout the emergency held hands, their weathered faces streaked with tears. A businessman who had seemed so important just hours earlier was embracing complete strangers, his expensive suit rumpled, his phone forgotten in his abandoned seat. Flight attendant Maria Santos saw Dr. Chen emerge from the cockpit and immediately moved toward him. Other passengers noticed, and a wave of recognition seemed to ripple through the cabin, the understanding that this quiet, unassuming older gentleman was somehow responsible for their survival. People began approaching him, grasping his hands, thanking him with voices breaking with emotion. "You saved us," a woman said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved all of us." Chen accepted their gratitude with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the emergency. He didn't minimize what had happened or deflect credit. He simply acknowledged their thanks and moved through the cabin, making his way toward the exit where emergency medical personnel were waiting to assess passengers for injuries. Outside the aircraft, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Fire trucks surrounded the landing zone, their crews standing ready despite the absence of fire or emergency requiring their intervention. Ambulances lined the runway, paramedics waiting to provide medical evaluation. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing images of the damaged aircraft that would be broadcast to a waiting world within hours. Captain Mitchell emerged from the cockpit about 20 minutes later, having secured the aircraft and completed the initial emergency procedures. He was immediately approached by federal aviation authorities and a representative from the airline. Their first questions were procedural: what had happened, when had it occurred, what decisions had been made. But as the initial debrief progressed, the focus inevitably shifted to the mysterious passenger, who had provided the technical expertise that made survival possible. "Where is Dr. Chen?" one of the federal investigators asked. "We need to take his statement about what occurred in the cockpit." Mitchell looked around the tarmac, suddenly realizing that the quiet engineer had simply melted back into the crowd of passengers being evaluated by medical personnel. He found Chen standing calmly with a paramedic who was checking his blood pressure, seemingly unbothered by the chaos surrounding them. "Dr. Chen," the federal investigator said, approaching with official credentials displayed. "I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the National Transportation Safety Board. We need to document your involvement in this emergency. Can you come with us to the operations center?" Over the next several hours, Dr. Chen provided detailed technical statements about the hydraulic failure, the mechanical backup systems, and the procedures he'd recommended. His explanations were precise, technical, and comprehensive, the statements of someone accustomed to communicating complex engineering concepts. He explained the design philosophy behind the mechanical backup systems, walked through the cascade failure mechanisms, and described his reasoning for recommending the specific emergency procedures. By evening, the story had broken nationally. News networks led with headlines about the mid-air hydraulic emergency and the retired aerospace engineer whose expertise had saved 143 lives. Social media exploded with the narrative, the unlikely presence of exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. The statistical impossibility of it captured the public imagination in a way that pure technical competence never could. Over the following weeks, Captain James Mitchell and Dr. Robert Chen became fixtures in the national media. They appeared on morning talk shows, evening news programs, and documentary features. The story was examined from every angle: the engineering perspective, the human interest angle, the role of fate and probability. Aviation schools began using the incident as a case study in emergency decision-making and crew resource management. The FAA initiated reviews of hydraulic failure procedures in regional aircraft. But what few people understood was the profound impact the experience had on the two men at the center of the story. Mitchell continued flying for 3 more years before retiring, but something had shifted in him. He'd been forced to confront his own limitations and the reality that expertise and training, while critical, weren't always sufficient without help from sources beyond one's control. He began mentoring younger pilots, emphasizing the importance of intellectual humility and the willingness to ask for help when facing problems that exceeded individual competence. Dr. Chen, for his part, had never expected to be thrust into the public eye at age 66. He'd spent decades designing systems that he hoped would never need to be used in real emergencies. The experience vindicated his life's work. The mechanical backup systems he'd advocated for, that some colleagues had dismissed as unnecessary, had quite literally saved 143 people. He spent much of the year following the incident giving lectures to aerospace engineering students and working with aviation authorities to review and improve emergency procedures. The two men maintained contact after the immediate media attention faded. Mitchell visited Chen's home in Boulder several times, and the engineer occasionally attended pilot community events. They never spoke extensively about the emergency itself. They both understood it too well, and words seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of what had occurred. Instead, they developed a friendship based on mutual respect and the shared knowledge of having stood at the precipice and returned. A year after the incident, at a formal ceremony recognizing aviation heroes, Captain Mitchell made a brief speech about what he'd learned. He spoke about the importance of recognizing the limits of individual expertise, about the value of intellectual humility, and about the role that preparation, training, and knowledge play when crisis strikes. He acknowledged Dr. Chen specifically, noting that the engineer's presence aboard Flight 447 wasn't luck. It was the result of a lifetime of dedication to understanding aircraft systems and designing safety features that might one day prove critical. For Mitchell, the deeper truth had become clear through reflection. The odds of having a retired aerospace engineer designer specializing in hydraulic systems sitting in row 14 of a half-full regional flight were indeed astronomically small. But he'd learned that while cosmic chance had placed Chen on the aircraft, it was human excellence, Chen's decades of knowledge, his calm under pressure, his willingness to engage with a desperate stranger, that had determined survival versus tragedy. The incident became known in aviation circles as the miracle on Flight 447, though Mitchell and Chen preferred to call it the day preparation met opportunity. They understood that while fortune had aligned in remarkable ways, it was the accumulation of knowledge, skill, training, and the willingness to act decisively in moments of crisis that truly determined the outcome. As Mitchell settled into retirement, flying small aircraft for personal enjoyment rather than commercial responsibility, he often reflected on that April afternoon in 2019. He thought about the 143 people who continued living their lives because an engineer had designed backup systems decades earlier, and because a pilot had possessed the humility to ask for help when expertise exceeded his own. In the end, the most important lesson wasn't about aircraft systems or emergency procedures. It was about the fundamental human truth that we are stronger together than we could ever be alone, and that sometimes survival depends not on our own brilliance, but on our willingness to recognize and accept the brilliance of others.